Thanks for inviting me. I think I'm the only American in the room I heard commented on a few times this morning. I hope that's, I don't know, are there any other Americans out there? But it's certainly a pleasure to be here, and I love the program that Samir and the organizing committee have put together. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to give you probably somewhat of a whirlwind tour of Candida auris. I tend to throw up a lot of slides and try to entertain you a bit as I try to give you a lot of information. And we already heard a little bit about Candida auris this morning. So there's fungus among us. That's what I like to talk about. I just want to point out that this is the common scenario that as clinicians, as microbiologists, that we actually just don't really want to know about fungal disease. I know training in this area and in infectious diseases during my time, you know, when you heard about a fungal infection, honestly, you didn't want to know about it. Why? Maybe because they had weird names, bad outcomes, toxic treatment. We've already heard about the limited diagnostics that we have. But I think we all need to continue to educate and make people aware. And I was telling Jacques during the break, half of my time I feel like is public health marketing. I need to market for the fact that mycology is important and these infections are killing lots of people. Just wanted to give you an overview. This is the mycotic diseases branch at CDC. You heard it mentioned a couple times. This is the fungal diseases group that responds to mycology issues both domestically and globally. So we're one of the few groups that exists like this. It's mainly, it's 2/3 laboratory, 1/3 epi. So we do a lot of laboratory-based work. And here's sort of our mission and some of our priorities. And I just want to point out that one of our priorities here is facilitate early diagnostic testing. We heard that today. We hear that from the room. You know, we don't develop diagnostic tests much anymore. There's a lot of good people out there doing those that have a lot more time than us. So just a couple issues about candidemia in general. We all know this. We all deal with it in our hospitals. In the US now, candidemia in most, well, I shouldn't say most, in many hospitals, certainly in this prevalence survey that was done, is the #1 cause of bloodstream infections. So we've done a great job of reducing bacteria, but not as good a job of reducing Candida. And so we deal with this every day. I'm sure you do as well here in England. The other thing that's important to note is, you know, it used to be Candida albicans, Candida albicans, Candida albicans. That's all we cared about. That's not the case anymore. The other species now predominate in the US. This is just some surveillance data that we have, but many hospitals see primarily Candida glabrata now, or even some of the other species, and albicans is no longer the threat or the problem that it used to be. And part of that is because if you look at, I love this picture because it shows giving prophylaxis and how it changes the makeup of the species. So you can see here on the top, these are number of days of prophylaxis, and just, we don't need to focus on what this is, but watch the gray go down. Similarly here, depending on what kind of prophylaxis, the gray shrinks and the other colors become more prevalent. So the species matter in Candida, and that's because species often confer or portray certain resistances. And this is just the issue that I'm going to talk about Candida auris here in about 3 seconds, but you know, our bigger problem is actually a kind of Candida resistance to Candida glabrata right now. Although I'm scared of Candida auris, I'm not as scared of Candida glabrata. But you can see here, these are just 3 different sites where we've been able to collect some data. Duke did their own, where you can see that a kind of Candida resistance, our first-line therapy, empiric therapy for candidemia, is going up, even approaching above 10%. And we know that this is important for survival. The higher, this is an elegant study looking at MIC rates, so the higher the MIC, the worse people did. And so we all know resistance makes a difference. So let's talk about Candida auris, our story. And before we do that, let's do a question. So go ahead and vote. I think they're going to put this up in a second, right? You guys going to put the voting thing up? Oh, there we go. So Candida auris is an emerging species of yeast that is concerning because, now I haven't told you anything yet, so I've decided to throw the questions in beforehand, see what you all think. So go ahead and bet. I know you all are going to get this right, even though I haven't even talked about it yet, but Matt did. Yes, good. So all of these are concerning, and you're going to hear about that here in a second. But let me tell you a little about it. You heard a brief history. I'm going to do a little bit of history as well. Candida auris. This was first isolated and described, at least in the ear of a patient in Japan. Therefore, the name auris. Then shortly thereafter, neighbors to the west in Korea described it in ear, but also in blood, and it actually talked about it, a Hemalonii-like organism, which is a closely related cousin to auris, and then finally described auris in 2011 from the blood. So really the first documented bloodstream infection. In India, our colleague Anu Chaudhry has been describing bloodstream infections for a number of years, started publishing in 2013, and by 2015, at least in ICUs in Delhi, was describing that 5 to 8% of all her candidemias were due to Candida auris. This is usually what happens in public health, and we get a call. So I put the call up here. So basically we got a call, and it was 2015 from colleagues in Pakistan. So we've been watching the Candida auris thing, but honestly we weren't doing anything about it. We weren't reacting. We were just curiously watching and learning. And then we got this call. There was an outbreak over a year period of time of 30 cases of Saccharomyces cerevisiae in the blood. And that's exceedingly rare. We were skeptical, but if it was happening, why? So we started helping our colleagues at the Aga Khan investigate that. In the meantime, they sent us isolates, which we then, as you can see, identified as Candida auris, and that really launched our global work in the area. Just to give you an idea here, this is sort of where Candida auris sits phylogenetically, and it is misidentified overwhelmingly as Candida Hemalonii, because the common biochemical methods don't distinguish it. Neither do most of the Vitex and other machines that hospitals use to identify their blood culture isolates. Now that's changing, thankfully, but at least Candida Hemalonii should raise suspicion of Candida auris. So we thought, wow, this bug is concerning. Why? Well, because our colleagues were telling us it was multi-drug resistant. At the time, we hadn't tested any to know. But we almost always saw resistance to fluconazole, or heard about resistance to fluconazole, and you'll see here in a moment variable susceptibilities to other azoles, Ampho B, and echinocandins. And then finally, as I just mentioned, it was very challenging to identify. It was often misidentified as Candida Hemalonii, and so we were wondering, is this actually being misidentified around the globe, and how much of a problem is it? So here we had sort of this rapid emergence since 2009, Japan, I just mentioned Korea, India. Then we heard about cases from colleagues in South Africa and Kenya and Kuwait, Pakistan, as I just mentioned, Venezuela and Israel. And so we got to look that it was emerging in multiple continents seemingly simultaneously around this 2009 period. And then colleagues were starting to tell us that in some of these locations, 40% now of their candidemia, so their bloodstream isolates, were actually Candida auris. So that's scary. Then we started looking into it in Colombia, Panama, and the US, so in the Americas, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about that story. After the Pakistan situation, we formed a quick group of collaborators, and we sort of tried to describe the early epidemiology, and this is just an outline of how we got together, and this is what it looked like. That they were all the way from infants to the elderly, that there were pretty similar risk factors to what we would see in candidemia normally, that there was often a polymicrobial, so multiple Candida species, that these patients were generally on antifungals when it was diagnosed. The median time for remission was around 17 days. And the mortality, at least in bloodstream infections in this early data, was 70%, so a little higher than we think about for candidemia normally. Matt gave a nice little intro to whole genome sequencing. So we took these isolates from these 4 different world regions, and what we found is that they were very, very different across these 4 regions of the world. Hundreds of thousands of SNPs, which is, he talked to you a little bit about that. So these are grossly different clades, as we're calling them now. And you can see here that whereas in the region, so within the region, they were highly clonal. 60, 70 or less. Actually, we're seeing a lot of places where it's 5 or 6 SNPs between regions. So we basically had these 4 distinct clades where we have very high clonality within the clade, but incredibly different across. And these, again, all emerging at about the same time. So profound phylogeographic structure, huge genetic differences among geographic clades, very high clonality within those, which suggested to us, based on the data that we had and based on our best analysis of the whole genome, which is obviously a changing field, that there was recent independent emergence in 4 different places. Looking at susceptibility. Now, we heard a little bit of talk about resistance this morning, obviously, and I think this is one of the scariest bugs that I've seen in the fungal world. You can see here that these are initial isolates. You can see that they have high MICs, but if you take a look at sort of the summary, this is what it looked like. 93% resistant to flu, 35, 1/3 resistant to ampho. And I can tell you that we now have over 300 isolates, and that still holds true. So yes, there is amphotericin B resistance, and it's bad. That's a drug we don't want to lose. We're losing it with this bug. You can see 41% are resistant to 2, but 4% of these were resistant to all 3 classes. Now that's not good, right? We haven't seen that before in Candida. So just to recap, auris bloodstream infections look bad, 70% mortality, high level of resistance, and this puzzling findings with whole genome sequencing, and I've already mentioned, just large differences but very clonal within these clades, suggesting this independent emergence. So we really, at this point, had more questions than answers. Why is it emerging now? Has it been here all along and we just misidentified it? Probably not, because we reviewed extensively globally with partners and colleagues around the world and our own collections, and we could not find it earlier, although there is an isolate from Korea, I think that was from 1996, but that's the only one that I know of, or maybe one more in the 90s, but it certainly wasn't in clinical collections that folks who had been collecting Candida in the 2000s and before. Why is it emerging in so many places simultaneously? I don't know, is there some change in antifungal use? Is this environmental? Are there risk factors specific for C. auris? Could transmission be occurring in healthcare settings, the way it seems to come into an area, set up shop, and then suddenly it's causing 40% of the candidemias? We were wondering what's happening with this organism. And then we talked to our colleagues over here, and Silka's going to present right after this, and I'm thrilled to see what she has to say. But we talked to colleagues here in the UK who were experiencing an outbreak, and I'm sure she'll talk to you about that. And just the summary of that was there were a bunch of patients that had it in their blood or were colonized with it, and they had a really hard time controlling it from an infection control standpoint. And with that information, we knew that it appeared, certainly the evidence was suggesting that this indeed was being transmitted in healthcare settings. So, why are we concerned? I already said it's multi-drug resistant, hard to identify, but now it causes outbreaks and is transmitted in healthcare settings, and that is not typical for Candida. So then we said, well, is it in the United States? And we looked, as I said, back through thousands of isolates, and we found one from 2013. At that time, we put out an alert, and we coordinated it with our special relationship over here with England. So they put out an alert. We put out an alert on the same day, which was great, Public Health England. And what I'm concerned about, and what I was most concerned about, and the reason I pushed hard for putting out an alert sooner than later, even though we really didn't know the situation yet in the United States, was because of this sort of scenario. So you all remember when CRE and this KPC was reported back in 2001. We had one state, at least in the US, with this. 15 years later, this is what the map looks like. So 48 states, or 47 states. I didn't include, Alaska's on here, so 48 states. So it spread over a 15-year period of time. And we were thinking, what did we do about CRE? Well, we didn't respond aggressively. We put out infection control guidance. We made people aware about what you should do. We tried to get the word out. This is a nasty bug. It's coming. But I don't think we did. we weren't on the ground every time there was an infection. So you're going to see that we're changing our philosophy here with Candida auris. I think of this as, you know, the newest MDRO, as people like to call these, multi-drug resistant organism, except for this time it's a fungus. And they're always bacteria. Well, guess what? There's a fungal one now. And is this sort of the equivalent of CRE or Acidonidobacter? With transmission in healthcare settings, which is not typical for Candida, so most docs, all of us who get candidemias, we're not worried about that candidemia transferring to the other patient or that. So we don't think about that with Candida. In this bug, you have to think about that. This thing really survives well. I know folks in the UK have been doing survival studies. We've been doing survival studies. It lives on surfaces, lives on skin for months, and it's hard to kill. And we obviously need a lot more research being done with that. So then I think I threw in a question here again, preemptively. Now that you just heard about all this stuff, let's try to answer this question. What of the following infection control practices are currently recommended for Candida auris? So standard precautions only. Contact, I like talking with the music in the background. I feel like a game show host. Great, yep, that is the correct answer. So we're gonna talk a little bit about that here. I want to give you the US scenario because you're going to hear from Silke here in about 15, 20 minutes about the UK situation. So focusing a little bit now on the US and sort of what we did post this alert. We began to hear about cases, and as we published in the MMWR is a you all know the MMWR, but we use it oftentimes to communicate information early about public health issues. And so in this case, we felt we needed to get something out fast that just described this was only 7 cases, but we wanted to get information out. Remember, it's about awareness, it's about education, and that's what we're about. So we put this out relatively quickly, and it summarized sort of our information as of August 31st. But now, if we look and see where we are today, so this is hot off the press as of a couple days ago, so I'm probably going to get in trouble talking about it, but we're up to 34 cases now in the US. And you can see how they're distributed. Most of them are in New York. There's one in New Jersey, which is across from New York. There's a Maryland case, which actually came from New Jersey. And then there's 3 cases in Illinois. We've been working with New York, obviously. That's sort of the epicenter for us right now in the United States. And we've gone there a couple different times and done investigations. We've done chart reviews and facility visits. We've done all kinds of microbiological testing of both patients and neighbors and rooms, etc. And again, learning a lot of this from the UK experience here in London. You know, we opted for a very aggressive approach to trying to work on it. Of the 34 isolates that we have so far, 26 blood, 3 urine, 2 respiratory, you can see how they go down the list. You can see the age range. One thing about our patients so far is they are very experienced healthcare patients. In other words, they've been in hospitals lots, they've been in healthcare environments. Many of them have lines and other procedures happening. So they aren't your typical candidemia, let's call it, patients. They're sicker, I would say, than the typical candidemia. Our evidence for transmission locally is, you can see the New Jersey cases and the Maryland cases, which was in a New Jersey resident, were at the same hospital. Illinois cases were all in the same long-term care facility. So that's the other place that we start. When you start dealing with long-term care, which is outside of the hospital, it presents a whole nother level of infection control challenges, as you all can imagine. And then the New York cases overlapped in sort of these small clusters at 2 different hospitals and a couple long-term care facilities. So then back to whole genome sequencing, and how have we used this again to help us try to elucidate maybe some of the emergence and transmission, at least within the United States. Here's the approach. I put this slide's just for Matt and Allie so that you can see how who do this stuff every day. I'm not a sequencer, so I'm not going to claim that. But we're doing MiSeq and HiSeq Illumina platforms. Our Chicago isolates, they're less than 3 SNPs, so they're almost identical. So based on the fact that this is we feel this is being introduced, then at least the philosophy is that if it's homegrown, it's challenging, because the India, the Venezuela situation that appears to have their own homegrown Candida auris, it sets up shop in the milieu of your hospital-associated infections, and it starts causing lots of candidemia. So as I said, 40% in some of these hospitals. I sort of think we're early. If you get an introduction from somewhere else and you haven't developed your own clade, your own clones yet, then maybe you have a chance to try to stop this from spreading. And that's been our attitude. We're gonna go after it. And so we've taken a very aggressive approach. And that's unheard of for fungi. People don't go respond to Candida. Every case we get reported to us, we are willing to send a team into the field, go to those hospitals, and try to see what we can do to beef up infection control. We culture everything. We do point prevalence surveys of the hospital. And we're even now considering screening. I know the UK has had some experience with screening. They'll probably talk about that a bit. But we haven't gone there yet. But it's an evolving situation. We also need to learn from those people that have real ingrained problems, and working with folks in India, where, as I said, some of these are 40% of their candidemias are now this Candida auris organism, multi-drug resistant. We need to get in there and understand what is happening. Is this Candida now completely set up shop in their hospital, but is it also now part of our commensal pathogens, or our commensal bacteria and fungi? Is it part of our microbiome? We know that Candida albicans glabrata and the other species are part of our microbiome, and we always felt like if you have a Candida glabrata infection or an albicans infection that gets into your blood, it's a translocation phenomenon. We essentially auto-infect ourselves because we're put on broad-spectrum antibiotics, we select for Candida, and we translocate that out when we're sick in the ICU or abdominal surgery, and we auto-infect ourselves. We don't know if that's what's happening in these situations where Candida auris has really become the #1 cause of bloodstream infection. So we need to collaborate. We're trying to work with India, and then within our own continent, down in the Americas, they're experiencing thousands of cases actually now. And so we've been able to go to Colombia and do on-site investigations, and we have been culturing the environment and the hospital environment, and we find it all over the place, to be honest with you. And so we're trying to understand more about what we can do to help prevent dissemination and widespread. And can we actually also disinfect and get rid of it? So how am I doing? Good? So the way forward, what are we sort of thinking as we move forward? I think it's somewhat of a dirt road, because for at least for the fungal community, we're not used to responding like this to a yeast. We tend to be a little more passive maybe, and we're trying to be super aggressive this time. So I think one of the things that we heard a little bit about this today and is stewardship. I mean, we need to be thinking about stewardship for fungal infections. We often think about them for bacterial, but obviously one of the best ways to help prevent fungal infections is to steward our antibacterials well. So I think that's part of one of the biggest risk factors for developing candidemia is overuse, misuse of antibiotics, as well our own stewardship of our own organisms. And I know Jacques mentioned today that we don't have it in the IDSA guidelines that you should do AFST for all Aspergillus. I tend to agree with him that I would like to see that done, but again, I'd like to see resistance testing done for everything. It is, though, however, in the Candida guidelines that they now recommend we do antifungal susceptibility testing for all Candida. So that's good. That's a step forward. It didn't used to be there. I do think that's going to be important, but as we're all hearing, there are less isolates, and sometimes they aren't available, but we still need to continue to do that, and certainly that's going to help in our antifungal stewardship specifically. And then finally, one of the things I always think about in stewardship is, remember, it's not stewardship and diagnostics are not just meant to be used to have a positive. I think the negative predictive value of some of these tests are exceedingly important in stewardship, because if we can do a beta-D-glucan, which is, they're here in the back, or a T2 test, and it's negative, and we can rule out Candida, then we can stop using the echinocandida right away. So no one's going to argue with someone who's sick with fever that you don't know what's happening, throwing them on multiple drugs for a couple days. But we got to be able to peel those off fast if they're not warranted. And so I think that some of these tests, and hopefully we can think of stewardship ways in which you rule something out and stop the drug. And so these things need to be looked at. I know they're doing that with T2, which is a new test. WHO and AMR fungi. We've already heard that there's not a lot of advocacy for fungal diseases. WHO has no experts in fungal diseases. We try to help them as much as we can, but there's no one there. When you try to call up, WHO, can I have a point of contact? There is none. So, but we're trying to make some progress with them. And there was a World Health Assembly vote a couple years ago, or a resolution, that basically said they have to set up surveillance for AMR. So the member countries vote on that, and they all agree. And so they formed this system called WHO GLASS, which stands for the Global Antimicrobial Surveillance System. Currently there are 8 bacteria in there. And they asked us to come and present the story or the reason why we should be including AMR fungi. Certainly Candida auris is, to me, the story that we should be talking about. And so we're setting up a pilot, working with others across the globe, hopefully some of you as well, to actually see if we can't form some sort of network that maybe eventually could be part of the WHO GLASS system if that's the direction we're headed. And finally, infection control is going to be key to trying to stop this from spreading. Again, Silka's going to talk to us probably about her experiences and the UK's experience with that. But certainly we're recommending, the usual hand washing, terminal cleaning, and disinfection. Now, disinfection for this bug has been a real challenge. Quat does not work. You have to double the bleach. We're now going to put out in a recommendation, probably today or tomorrow, I don't know when it's going to go out, that you need to use an anti-tuberculoid disinfectant. So just a fungal indication does not do the trick. So we're bumping up the sort of recommendations because at least the Environmental Protection Agency and others that are looking at this organism they're not having very good success in killing it. So and I'm sure you'll hear about that from the next talk. Finally, one of the things that's sort of exciting to me, I've been doing fungal diseases now for a couple decades, and one of the things that's sort of exciting for me is that there are some new drugs in the pipeline. I mean, they're still a few years off, clearly, but there's some new mechanisms of action, which is going to be important, because if Candida auris takes hold, and I haven't talked to you about the resistance and the mechanisms, but suffice it to say that this bug seems to acquire resistance pretty readily. The resistance mechanisms across clades are completely different. So it's not like they're sharing the same resistant mechanism. They have the ability just to develop resistance. And so having new targets, new delivery ways, I think is going to be really important. So at least that's exciting. And I think I'll end there and just acknowledge a lot of the people that work on this stuff, and then the New York investigation team, which continues to forge ahead with our Candida auris problems. And again, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for your attention.